gentlemen, we now control your TV screen. We control the vertical. We control the horizontal. For the next 2 hours, sit back and relax as we take you from the inner person to the outer limits.
Welcome, everybody. It's good to see you. And this is our third trip here. As they said at the museum, this is the encore. But chapter 3, we've had fun putting it together, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I have enjoyed being with these two young men. And I think we're going to have fun today, and we have time for lots of questions. That's why we have the extra hour. Okay, next. Now I've lost, there we are. Anson, Eddie, and they can tell you more about Anson because they have a little bit of age on me. I'll turn it to you, gentlemen.
I'm going to start just by saying thank you for coming. My wife has a relative who came all the way from Billings, and I told him, I said, you knew what we were going to do and you came anyway. So we're really happy to see you, and it's a Saturday morning, and we can be grateful we're not running track across the street or in that particular audience on a snow end day. Well, it's a pleasure. This guy here, Al, knows there are stories that ramify forever. He's called, by the way, that's a beautiful Jack Richard photo of Anson. And
do we?
used to.
No, this is a Jack
That was
Richard
Jack,
photo.
Jack.
And Dad got him to wash up, shower, wash his beard, clean shirt. And there's a elk tag over his left pocket. And I asked Dad, I said, how did you talk him into that? He said it was tough getting him here cleaned up like that, but he did show up that way for his portrait. Next.
Well, he lived up South Fork, and there's the picture of Dewey. This is the day he was acquitted for the murder of the artist up South Fork, Bob Myers. He was so confident of being acquitted that he came to the jury when the judge announced the verdict, and he had his bedroll and everything he had in jail with him because he knew he was going to leave there and go to the Eagles Club. And there was a controversy. Bob Myers was a very popular guy, and Anson had confessed with some law enforcement people, but he said later to the jury that, well, the day he was thinking of that, he said there was kind of a blue light around the door frame. He said it kind of took my brain away. Well, that was it. Anyway, he lived a hermit's life. He was violently hostile with Bob Myers. They had dust-ups, and I'd often fish through there, and I'd holler at him because I was scared to death that he wouldn't know who I was. I'd say, it's Al, down the river. And then he had all these cats, and I had a creel full of fish, and the cats would jump up on the creel and eat, right? He never fed them. But he was caught one day he had a horse manure poultice, hot water, and he'd been hit by a grizzly, which tore right through the back half of his leg. He said, don't tell anybody. That's the first time I've ever had one of those damn critters get me. And he said, well, what did you do? He said, I just took my gun and put it in his mouth and blew his head off. And he said, but he always recommended a horse turd poultice. And people have never frowned on that. Anyway.
Well, Al told me the story. I was out of town when the trial occurred, and then I heard from others as well that they actually, I think, put Al on the stand as a hostile witness because Anson had spread it around that there's not room enough up that river for both me and him. And my understanding is that the prosecuting attorney asked Al, is that true? And Al said, well, that is. And then the defense attorney in the cross-examination says, Al, has Anson ever told a tall tale? And Al said, oh, yes, he has. And he said, well, how do you know? And Al's remark was, well, it takes one to know one.
Anyway, he's real. You did. Yeah, you made that up. I heard.
I'd like to add one other thing. Meeting Anson in the backcountry, he rode into my uncle Chew Frost's camp, and the first thing he did when he got off his horse is he pulled out a pair of nippers and started pulling the shoes off his horse. And I looked, he had shoed the horse, putting the shoes on backwards, and I said, why were they on backwards? He said, I didn't want anybody to know that I'd left my home on Ishua to come up here and work. Now think about that, 10 miles that he put those shoes on and rode up there to go to work as a guide for Chew Frost. But he was a good storyteller, I'll guarantee you.
Well, there were so many stories that the one that was really something, he said he was working for the government on a mysterious thing during the war, and he didn't want anyone to know what it was. We thought, well, here we go again. And I'll tell you what, he was hired by the U.S. Defense Department, the War Department, to check on those balloons that were being manufactured in Tokyo, put up in the air with an automatic ballast system to burn the forests of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. 9 of them landed in America, 1 in Oregon, which was a fatal thing for a bunch of kids that found it. And so that was his search. And they would land and then they would ignite. I figured that the wood would be something we needed in the war effort, and the Japanese had unbelievably fitted them with automatic systems of ballast to go across the sea. And you look that one up, that was real.
Al and I were at one time very young. And at that time, it was World War II, you just mentioned it. And Dad was in charge of civil defense. And there were little bands that you could put on your arm. And so he recruited Al and I to check on blackout observance, whether people had closed their shades during a warning. They'd blow the siren for air raid warnings, and which of course never happened. But in the process, you were also supposed to look for balloons, particularly on a moonlight night, to see if any came. I never saw any, but we were proud to wear the CD patch on our arms. I think I was 13 and Al was 12. I mean, you can't beat that kind of authority at that age.
That's the worst offense was everything was blackened out because we were waiting for a raid. I mean, the Japanese War Relocation Center was out there with 11,000 people, third largest city in Wyoming, bigger than Cheyenne and Casper. And so blackout time came, and the only thing that happened was down on the main street, they couldn't put out the eyes on the owl up there, but it says J.H. Vogel. It's right there today. And those things were run by a battery, a car, an automobile battery, and nobody could find out how to turn them off. But they did shoot at them.
I wonder who.
Well, I don't know. The guys at the Cowboy Bar. Oh, well, that was enough of that. Anyway, that's Anson.
Dewey, you still in the audience?
Yo,
Hey, Dewey.
What does Anson have in his pockets there in this picture?
Well, that's a Pulp magazine article about.
there was a
Oh, excuse me, Dewey,
magazine
go
of
ahead.
the day, tabloid size, called True Crime. The Western Drug Company up the street had gotten in a pile of these things, crate up, and Anson went down, bought most of what was left, and in his pocket, he's handing out free copies of that magazine. About $2 at the time. Anybody who would have one. I've still got one somewhere.
What was the title of the article?
I don't remember.
Something about a murder up South Fork or famous Art? I don't, but he had plenty
The guy
of,
who wrote Tarzan and the Tetons.
No,
Rode around, but it was
No.
almost as bad as that.
well,
good.
at the end of that trial, I have to confess, Lynn isn't here, so I can tell stories. I don't think she's here. Oh, she is. I mean,
No,
I'll
here's
be
Art,
very careful about this. Anyhow,
here's Art Holman now. You
Yeah,
can tell him
after
a little
it's
bit
all
about
over.
Art and
I'm
Evan.
just gonna finish
Oh.
with this, Alan.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
let me
So-
interrupt.
So Lynn said, after she heard the story, and Anson had been acquitted, and Lynn was a little incensed about that, but because we just come from Oregon, and she said, well, then I assume they're hurting everybody and tracking the country to find the real killer. Well, nobody ever found anybody who did that, but this guy he marched at every parade with his World War I uniform on. He was quite a guy. Art Holman. Art was the brother of Evan Holman. The two of them were Rough Riders for Buffalo Bill. Art worked at everything in this town. And Evan, of course, was foreman at the T.E. Ranch. And I've already told the story of Evan and his horses. But go ahead, Al. You worked on the road crew. He was on the road crew.
Well, we did
Working
that.
in
We
town.
worked at the TE, the two of us for three summers, 17, 18, 19 age. But the best one was Evan Holman, his brother, who had that very high voice. And he sold a brace of horses. What was that tale?
Well, it's a great, if we've told them before, don't stop us. It's a great story. Evan trained draft horses, and a dude from the Belknap came to the T.E. Ranch and wanted to buy a brace of those draft horses. And Evan sold him those draft horses, and this guy came back in 5 days, and he was really smoking. He was angry, and he went up to Evan and he said, you told me those were good horses, he says, and I paid you a lot of money. You dissembled with me, you lied to me, and I want my money back. And Evan, in that high voice, said, no, he says, I didn't tell you they'd pull. I told you to do your heart good to see them pull.
That was it. I'll never forget that one. But they were a pair, and great characters, great humans. That's the worth of many of these wonderful people. Well, Billy Howell, there he was, and Mary Shawver. That was up at the Cross Sabers
Home Lodge.
Home Lodge. Yeah. I think the Girl Scouts, I think Ann was a Girl Scout at that place from Graybull. But anyway, you could tell them a little bit about Billy Howell. He was kind of a freighter too. He was a taxi guy. He rustled stuff, but he was just a nice-looking cowboy, and people loved him. The tourists loved him. The dudes loved him.
Easy guy to talk to, even as a young kid.
Yeah.
That hat doffed in the air was typical of him. He'd doff his hat almost to everybody. The ladies, even young guys like us, he'd doff his hat.
In the background, under the horse's stomach, is Howell Mountain, which was named after him. And when he died, his ashes were taken up to Howell Mountain by Freddie Garlow. And Freddie Garlow and someone else that went with him across the river, and they stopped and dug out a bottle of whiskey, and they each had a drink. And then they thought, well, Billy ought to have a little, so they shook a little ashes out on the ground, poured a little whiskey there. Well, by the time they got up the top of Howell Mountain, the box was empty, but they had a hell of a good time taking him up to Howell Mountain.
It's true. Well, there's a guy, intrepid, history, and they would often say, what are you doing now? Bob Edgar went out and found those cabins. Thank God they're still there. And that old trail town is still there, but no one was ready to do that. He would find them, he would number them, the logs and put them back together if he had to haul them. And that beautiful attraction out there at the Trail Town is very definitely to Bob Edgar, who was a sharpshooter. I tell you, he was terrifying. He'd be at the Cody Auditorium. He had a beautiful wife, and she would hold a cigarette, and he would hold a mirror like this and shoot the cigarette out of her mouth. And then he'd outline her body, which was rather spectacular in itself, with 22 and then. But his brothers right around, Larry Edgar, just a great guy. But that was Bob. But he gave us history and he gave us beautiful heritage.
Oh, he was Lynn's classmate and the kindest guy, and he is co-author of a great book about the Pitchfork Ranch. If you get a chance to read it, I think its title is Ranch of a Legend or something like that. So it's beautiful history. He could write, he could draw, he could photograph, and he had a blue-collar sense of history that few professionals ever had.
And even though he wasn't a pro, he was very instrumental in the creation and finding of the investigation of the Mummy Cave up the North Fork when Dr. Harold McCracken went through that and did some scientific papers that are very available. Anyway, it's still there. Oh, well, there he is. Think of him falling off a horse onto a steer, 6'6". And God, he was tough, shoulders. But that's Bud Pilcher. Married a gal named Connie. He did the living and she made the living worthwhile. She had money. And Bud would get a few drinks and he'd pick on people, which was unfortunate, but he did pick on Frosty Fogg, who was a lovely guy around here. And Bud punched him up one night at Cassie's, and the next time Frosty came into Cassie's, he had a little paper bag, and he put this .45 pistol out there. He said, "Bud, does that make me bigger than you are?" And Bud said, yeah, it does. And Bud had a serious thing. He could read reading, but he couldn't read and writing. And that was his, and so he would, Mel Stonehouse would read him about the war. Well, what happened there today? Well, let's see, they invaded Normandy, and then they went through Paris. Oh my God! Now they're in Italy, and he get on. He said, and you know, they even caught that guy Mussolini. He said, well, what did they do with him? He said, they assassinated him. He said, God, he said they should have killed that son of a bitch. So, but that was Bud. He was big and strong.
He didn't have an ounce of fat on him. He was 240 pounds, something like that. And he did do steer wrestling, what they called at that time bulldogging. He had a 3-second record up on Stampede Avenue that wasn't beaten for years until the pros came. But a great story. Dick Lofsgarden, who's on this paper as well, who is foreman who succeeded Evan Holman and the great foreman of the T.E. Ranch, designed a thing while I was working up there that was a lift for bales of hay so that you could put them on the top as well as on the bottom, and you could run 20 feet or more of carry with the bale of hay. And when the bales were wet, it was a perfect thing. Well, they had, the machine had a motor failure, so he had driven it into town, and Les Bowman, who was a pilot, who lived just up the South Fork, flew it back to the TE, landed on the TE field, and Bud was there. And Bud was feeling no pain. It was late afternoon, and Les Bowman deposited the motor. Dick put it on, then Les wanted to take off. And Bud went behind the plane, and if you know those small private planes, there's a handle on the tail. And Bud sat down on the field, grabbed the handle, and when Les tried to get the plane to go, he revved it up, and Bud was so heavy and so strong he couldn't get it going. And I can remember Les leaning out of the cockpit saying, "Let go, Bud, let go."
Well, there they are, the PM, and there's Bud in the middle. See the size of him. And then Les Bowman had that ranch right on the curve of by the bridge, the South Fork Bridge, down there below, right next to.
Near Issawa.
Yeah, right, Issawa. And then Dick Lofstarden was the longtime foreman at the TE, all through the years of Woodruff owning it, and even the Charles and Ann Duncan. But anyway, there he is. He saved his money, and in those days, the old boss would go off to Issawa Plantation with Bob Woodruff, and then he called Dick back, and he said, "Dick, they're going to have a stock split." They don't do that anymore because it's illegal. But then Dick said, "Well, I think we have about $5,000 together, and I'll buy some Coca-Cola stock." Well, there are lots of Coca-Cola millionaires in Atlanta, but when old Dick died, I think he had about 500 grand worth of Coca-Cola, all waiting for the tip. Going to have a stock split. Oh, I think I'll get some more of that stuff.
He was our boss. Anytime he thought we were slacking, he'd come out and start swinging bales himself, which would make us angry and help us to work harder. But when he retired, when Bob Woodruff retired, sold the ranch, and Dick, of course, was then retired and had all that money. One of his great friends was Johnny Jernberg, who was where Herb Allen, J Bar 9. And he and Johnny were great friends. So I'm at the ranch, the Bobcat, at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, and just happened to be there, a young man. And so a truck came up to the gate, and it took about 5 minutes for whoever was in the truck to get out of the truck, open up the gate, drive the truck through, and come. That's Dick calling right now.
He's up there. He's not down here. He's
Sure
up there.
what we were telling is true.
Yeah, that's it.
Anyhow, so the car finally the truck drove down to the ranch, and I was standing out there, and I suspected what was going on. They'd been on about a week's toot at that time. So when they got out of the truck, I said, would you like to have a drink? And old Dick said, "Well, I don't mind if I do." And Johnny and he got out, walked into the place. We had a little bourbon in the house, and they started to talk. And Dick said, "John, Pete used to ride old Bartender because he was a tall horse, 17 hands." And Johnny said, "Well, that's something." Why'd they call him Bartender? He said, "Well, we were coming off the Issawa Trail." He says, in a rainstorm late, he said, and he slipped down about a 25-foot draw right down to the bottom, and he was carrying all of the whiskey. And he said, we ran down to see how he'd fared, and he was doing okay, but best part was he didn't break a single bottle of that whiskey, and so we called him Bartender. And old Johnny said, "Well, I'll be damned." And Dick said, "Well, by God, it's true."
Well, there was another time when it would rain on the TE and the haying was going on. Dick and his pals would just come over to the Bobcat, and they'd play cards and I don't know what the hell they were, but anyway, at one time, there was a guy named Joe, and he happened to soil one of the beds. He went to bed with his spurs on, and then he had some kind of an upheaval, some colonic disruption, and everything all over. And Dick said, "You son of a bitch, what were you doing? This is Sim's house. You can't do that." The classic statement was, "I thought I was up." We always said that. Now I say, "Well, I thought I was up." You never think of the symbolism of all that. Enough of that. Well, no, yeah. The old sheriff,
Oh, yeah,
Harley Kincaid.
Harley Kincaid.
He was a genial giant. He took the place of Blackburn. And how many years was Harley there? He was always accessible. His whole family was here. There's other Kincaids, and you'll see some of those in a minute. But he was all heart, and Dad was infirm and wanted to go to Red Lodge where he'd played ball, and Harley would come pick him up, take him over to Red Lodge, and they'd go to one of the bars, and they'd say, "This is Simpson. He played center field here in Red Lodge," and Harley they'd have that little sandwich, and but he was more than a law enforcement. He was a counselor, and he was deeply loved, and a lot of his kin are here around.
There sure are. Some may be here in the audience, but this guy was the quintessential small town sheriff who knew everybody. Everybody knew him, who could help you more than hurt you in any consequence, who helped a lot of young kids get by and do well in this community. He was a special guy.
Now there's his brother with a pretty good hide there, and there's Tommy Trimmer, whose daughter died just 2 or 3 weeks ago. Nancy, and that's a hide there, and that was Frank. That's Harley's brother. Is that a black or?
I'm not sure. It looks like a grizzly.
It looks like a grizz, doesn't it?
Frank-
It doesn't have a hump, it's all flat.
That's true. Frank and his wife, when the scout camp was built by Husky Oil, he and his wife lived up there for 15 years and took care of the Boy Scout camp on the North Fork, winter and summer. And they had 3 sons, and we could spend the day talking about those young men too, but we're not going to.
And they're around. You'll know them. Now, there's one more. There's Harold.
That's a good.
They were all together in construction
Yeah.
as younger men, and then they all went different ways.
Yeah.
Great family up on the hill, and they good athletes in that family. Carl particularly, and Tommy. They both could play basketball. Carl could play anything, and Keith was the older one. But and Pinky, she was the precious one.
That's right. She was from Cody High. She was with the Babe Martolio and all. But there was, there is a Kincaid down under the hill. You wanted that, we never see him, but he was on the city council, and they started a new sewage lagoon, and they called it the Jerry Kincaid Sewage Lagoon. And he asked me to dedicate it. And his mother was sitting in the front row. I said, "Every day in the normal course of activities, we'll think of you."
Moving right along.
I got to go back for a second to Pinky. Pinky, there were 2 friends of hers. They were just dynamite high school girls. We were younger, and we idolized them all, wanted to marry them if we could. But Becky Taggart, a girl by the name of Inez Root, and Pinky had a Model A car, and they named it Shasta. And we asked her, "Why did you name that car Shasta?" She said, "Because Shasta have oil, She has to have gas. She has to have water. They were dynamite.
They were beautiful too.
They
They
sure were.
made us go home and take cold showers after we'd see them. Now there we go. There's a little more on Dick Ballinger. There's a picture of him in a moment here, I'm sure, and Leon Wright. Dick Ballinger was the NCAA 167-pound champion of the United States, All-American. There he was. And he was right out of Cody High. His brother, Lee, was in my class. In fact, there were only about 4 of us left. Jerry Lansbury, Don Kurtz, and Harold Lee up in Alaska. That's class of 49. But Dick Ballinger and was the works. As I say, he took on all the Oklahoma City guys, all the Iowa guys, and he won the whole stuff. And so there's going to be a commemoration of this wonderful young man who died some years ago. And Lee is still living and still came and picked me up about 2 years ago and almost flanked me down, but I was sick. That's enough now. But there's the other one. This is Bob Rank. He was the NCAA heavyweight national champion of the United States. We fought for Wisconsin. And he tried out for the Olympics, and he lost in a split decision to a guy who went and won the gold medal at the Olympics and later died in the ring. And Bob said, well, I could have died in the ring. He became a lawyer, and he was practiced with Kep and I over in Jackson. But these two men, we've got the little money scratched together, and we'll talk to our good athletic director, who's doing a beautiful job, who was the athletic director of the year. And this will be the 2 young men from Cody High School that went on to the top of the profession, 2 heavyweights and 167. There they are. He had a left hand that just was his natural. There's his award at the University of Wisconsin from Cody, Wyoming. And the same thing we'll be doing with Dick Ballinger. And put it in the trophy case, let the kids know that you can go to the top of the game right out of here. Anyway, lots of great guys.
Bob was a year older than me, great friend and a great guy. His dad was a barber, and there'd be a picture of him here later as a baseball player. But he was self-taught, and he, when he came back from Wisconsin, he was in the Wisconsin Hall of Fame. Dick is in the University of Wyoming Hall of Fame. They're both going to be in the Cody High School Hall of Fame, and that would be very appropriate for these 2 great athletes and great guys, wonderful men. Loved this guy. I remember at Bob's funeral in Jackson, just a small moment, they added it to the chuck wagon there, where the singers are, and where the what the heck they call that in Jackson? Somebody would know that somewhere. Bar J Wranglers, right?
Yes,
Thank you. So there were about 200 plus people at that ceremony. And they asked Al and I to say a few words because we'd known him in high school. And there were some gray hairs around. And all I could think of was, you know, Bob, everybody, I see a lot of fellas here. Bob, at the age of 85, could have whipped all of you, and you could see nods all over the place.
And then he'd say, can't we spar? You know, just why you're just a chicken. You just, you know, we'll just spar a little. Well, I could see guys step up and bloody running nose, and and he'd say, you know, you're kind of fat, Al, and you're out of touch, and now hit me. Well, I did, you know, and he said, boy, that's a that's a fairy dust. And then I got so damn mad, and I was just furious, and I just brought one up from the floor and just hit him in the jaw and started running. I was down by the Blair drug by the time he got up. He said, come back, Al, it didn't hurt. I said, I'm not going to die out here. Enough of that. Well, there we are. There she is, Lucille Nichols Patrick. She was an iconic figure. Tell us, a great author.
Oh, she's got some wonderful books. One about her dad is a priceless book called The Candy Kid. That's J.C. Kid Nichols, who was a wrestler. I think we talked about him before. He used to drink olive oil to make sure that the opponents to slip off his hide. He thought that would work that way. But he was a famous guy around here and a blacksmith. She wrote a beautiful book about him, and then the book that she wrote about Cody, Best Little Town by a Damn Sight, is a book you ought to try. It's well written and it's fun to read. And she was a good historian, great lady.
An artist.
And an artist, boy, was she.
And a real source of history. She loved her history, and there's a lot of stuff she left behind. I don't know where all her papers are, but Nick's around, he'd know. Anyway, she has wonderful family around here who are part of the heritage, but she was a force. I was real frightened by her when I was young. She'd light fireworks and throw them at us.
Moving on.
Oh boy,
boy.
there's
Three old
there's
timers.
the trio. Well,
Many
we've
would
shown
rank.
that before. I know we have, but there's Carolyn Lockhart.
Yeah.
This on the left, Vern Spencer.
Vern
What did
Spencer.
we call Vern? What was his title? We'd call him the
Professional old timer.
professional old timer. And Aurelia Hollister,
Yeah.
who was part of the Wild West show. She was the county officer for 30 years. And Vernon had the house was where the Eagles lot is, or where the Eagles house, and Vern was kind of he would remember every date of anybody that died, and I joined the Eagles so I could park in their lot there, and I still pay the dues. It's a good club. But anyway, he said one day, he said, come on over to my house, which I did time to time. He said, he took me to where his mother died. He said, you see that little, right there, that little part, she died right there. That's her impression of her body. And this was where she laid her head, right on that pillow. And I thought, well, this is getting pretty deep. And that was Vern. He was a chronicler of death. But he was also, you had to watch carefully, kind of sort it all out as to what he was. Some of it could have been true too, like what we're doing, it could have been true. Anyway, there they are, but Carolyn Lockhart, he was her protector, and Aurelia, she was a dear. Well, anyway, you could.
Yeah, one of the commentators about Vern, who was a Western writer, great guy, over in Matisse, said that Vern's writings, and he did write stuff, he said, and I'm sure that everything in it was true, and if it wasn't, it could have been.
Moving on.
Anyway, yes. Oh boy, there he is. Now that was our idol. He would be around town, and if he'd see a kid, he'd say, "Would you like to go up on take a little flight? Check with your parents." Well, we never did, because you just jump in there, and there he'd go. And there he is in the war. He was training P-38 Lightning aircraft, but he would tell us that when he was going to go over the main street of Cody to do some tricks, and he'd come off of the hill there, and then he'd do the bemamo roll, which was something like this, or the falling leaf pattern, which in about 100 feet above the pavement, he'd gun it and go up. Well, we weren't with him in that, but we would watch him and cheer for him, and he was an artist of the early aircraft.
It was great on any sunny morning to wake up and hear that engine of that plane, and then go to the window or go outside and watch him do aerobatics. And he was fabulous at it. And he was doing it for the town and for the kids. Great pilot. He, of course, is the pilot who flew off of Airplane Meadow up in the thoroughfare with Barbara Nichols.
This is with his tri-motor, and he flew for $15 a passenger over Yellowstone Park. And that was back in the 30s. And that plane today is at the Naval Air Station, Pensacola. And when I was there on my 50th reunion, I verified that tri-motor is sitting there in the museum at Pensacola, Florida. Now, next one is the Ryan.
No.
Go ahead and tell them.
You go ahead.
Well, it's a wonderful story because Barbara Nichols, Lucille's younger sister, Lucille was kind of a tomboy and a wonderful horsewoman and a Westerner of the first rank, those of you who have known her. And Barbara was her younger sister, quite pretty, very attractive girl. And she was up in the thoroughfare on a pack trip, hunting trip, and she was stricken with appendicitis, which was really serious, a serious acute case of appendicitis. There wasn't any way to get her down. There wasn't any way to get somebody up, except they brought Doc Dakin up by airplane. Bill Mundy landed on the meadow that is called today Airplane Meadow in the middle of the thoroughfare. And Doc Dakin took care of Barbara and then flew them back down. Had to clear the way, and they just cleared the trees. And the next week on the cover of New York Times was a picture of that plane with a title, High Mountain Rescue, and a beautiful story about it. They had to pull the plane up to the top of the meadow. And the picture, I don't know whether that's it, but they put the horses, the horses were roped, put ropes on the wings of the plane.
That's Lucille in the White Horse.
That's Lucille. And she was one of the 4 horsemen that pulled it up to the top of the meadow so it could take off, take a running leap and get off the meadow. Anyhow, great story and an exciting piece of our legends in this part of the country.
To take off, he had to go down, and they just barely made it. Dakin said, I don't care what, I'm not going to come back here on a horse, if I can. And anyway, it was a harrowing experience, but only Mundy would have pulled it off. It's a picture of it up at the airport on that one.
Just a quick point out here. If you look up here in the left corner above the wing, right here, you can see the camp. There's the tent from the hunting camp. And underneath the wing right here are a couple of little markers that mark the end of the meadow. And Bill had to be in the air when he hit those markers or he was doomed.
That's great.
Oh,
boy.
There's a pair. One of them,
Mary
the
is
kin
right
is
there.
right there. This is Chet and Mary Blackburn from Ralston, Wyoming. He was the ditch rider and everything else. It was a terrible drought one year, and he came in to see me. He said, people are trying to shoot me. I'm making them take the right amount of water, and they're changing the weirs. I said, well, call the cops or call Harley or somebody. Anyway, Mary and Chester had the guts, talk about profile and courage, to say, let's remember that the people who were at Heart Mountain were U.S. citizens. they weren't Japs. They were American citizens, the bulk of them. There were a few who pledged to Japan. And she said we ought to do something to recognize what we did there, which caused by war hysteria and racism. We couldn't identify the Germans. They were all over around here. Emblem Bench was called the Germania Bench. They changed the name to Germania to Emblem. And so, and you couldn't identify the Italians. In fact, there was a prisoner of war camp down near Glen Rock, and that was near Sunrise, where all the workers were Italianos, and they were just tickled to death to see some of their colleagues. But in the prisoner of war, they had their own camp down there. Anyway, they were the instrumental in the what you see out today of honoring U.S. citizens. Memorials is directly by those two people who had the guts, and they took some flack too. Leave them alone. We were on ration, out there. We were on gas ration and sugar, and they were eating. They were getting fed. Well, they were. The mess hall was described as Norman Evans said it was just the same stuff. But anyway, the tribute, there ought to be another plaque out there for those two beautiful people. That's my view.
Mary, it's great to see you.
Yeah, you bet.
Here.
Right here,
And,
the daughter.
You don't have to get up, but you can wave. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
great.
that's the daughter of
that's
Marion
great.
Chester.
Marion Chester.
Right there.
God bless you. That was a wonderful gesture.
Yep. Oh, there we go.
Oh, boy.
Now there they are. Shad Martolio, he had an impact on many of us here, like Waller, who will be a little bit. And then there he was, and then there's Babe right there in later life, and there she was in high school. And we called, when they got married, we called him the Italian stallion and the Greek goddess. And her name was Babe Apostolo.
Babe Apostle. Sylvia.
Sylvia.
Beautiful girl.
Apostolo, yeah.
Shad was a wonderful guy. Chased a coal truck when he was a kid just to get coal to warm the family where he was living in the Midwest. So when he came to Wyoming to play football, that was a change of life for Shad. And he then changed lives all around this town after that was over. Stayed here forever.
And there are
got
a
here.
lot of the family still around.
Yep.
Tony and then Orin Sheridan, Larry, and they're around. And you'd be more interested to know that there were 3 Greek Orthodox churches in Wyoming. The Greeks were one of the ethnic groups that settled Wyoming because Wyoming looked like Greece, just rocks. And they came here and they started the Mayflower Cafe. They started one in Cheyenne. There was a Mayflower in Casper, and that was three Greek Orthodox church. In fact, Louis, her mother, was buried in the Christ Episcopal Church with a Greek Orthodox priest. Anyway, but there they are. They were a great part of many families in this town who were still love them and think of them as we do. They were very generous people. They weren't people of substance. But when they had a party, nobody brought a bottle of beer or a sandwich. They had it all ready for them. They were just as generous and kind as you can imagine.
I'll mention many of the communities, the Greek communities around the state. If you were ever on a statewide campaign or you had some things to do around the state, you had to stop by some of those churches, particularly Father Kotsaki's in Rock Springs, and then you would get in the back of your car a whole pan of spinato pita. So you had to.
Baklava, too.
You had to detail the car for months afterwards. because
Well,
the
we
time
learned
to
one
come
thing,
back.
ouzo is not bad, but retsina tastes like wood. Ouzo is very good, it'll clear nasal passages, but retsina, forget
That's
it.
right. Somebody said that the difference was that Retsina did taste like wood. Ouzo, they compared to a paralytic stroke.
It's true. Anyway, they are part of Cody, and the kids and the spouses of kids are all over the place,
Oh
rather.
boy, they are a great family.
Okay. Oh my God, old Dick
Dick
Steck.
Steck.
He's Steck's IGA, and boy, he was a tradesman and a activist and citizen and great family guy and there just so many things that he did. His kin are here, still around. But it was Steck's IGA. He hired a lot of young people and put them to work, and he was active in every as a citizen of Cody, and known to everybody, even when he was sorting cabbage down there, or show you what to eat or what was going to be good.
Tell the story of Dick, who hired a guy to help him, and some lady flouncing about and being very imperious came up to this younger clerk and said, "I want a half a head of lettuce." And he said, "Well, madam, we don't do the what?" She said, "I insist." "And who's your manager?" "Well, it's Mr. Steck." "Well, I'd like to see your manager." So this poor kid took the gal back to see the manager and Dick, and the kid didn't realize the gal was right behind him. And he told Dick, he said, "This dumb broad wants a half head of lettuce." And when he turned around, here she was. And so he said, "And this nice lady is willing to take the other half." So good old Dick, oh boy.
Oh, this was a frightening fellow. This was Frank Krause. This was the superintendent of schools. And we didn't realize he was a diminutive type of fellow, small of stature, but one summer I was working for the county, so we were going through all the records for the police department and found out that Frank had I think he'd had a glass of wine or something, and then it was listed as a prize fighter, and we didn't know that, but Jerry Lanchberry learned it because he was smoking a cigarette one day, and Frank said, "Jerry, I told you before about that." And Jerry said, "Well, you know, figure he was bigger than Frank was." And Jerry said that Frank just punched him in the gut, knocked him backward. He said, "Boy, I don't want to mess with that guy again." But he was forceful, and he lived in that that southwest house right on the corner across from the Winona Thompson, which is on the corner. He and his wife there, and they had children. But he was in all business. And who was his principal? It was the other guy was he was in Sheridan. His son lived over there.
Samson.
Anyway,
He was coach, but Frank walked very erectly.
Yes, he did.
And very quietly, and he was soft-spoken. And you really paid attention every time he walked into a room, every time you saw him. I can remember one disciplinary time, because we all tried to avoid that. After school, I was called up because I guess I was throwing spit. What you do as a kid in study hall, you mess things up because you're not studying. And it's like the guy said, what was it like to study in Wyoming? He says, you're asking the wrong guy. Anyhow, took me into the office. Here he was, half my size, and he would use his index finger to remind you of something he was trying to say. And he would do it like this. And that finger felt like a full fist punching in the shoulder because he knew how to hit. And boy, he could remind you of things. So please take the picture off. It's really bothering me.
But he just quickly, he was watching us at a class making faces at the teacher, but you don't know if you learn fast that if a person has glasses on and they're looking at a blackboard, you can see what's going on behind you. Well, we were doing, all this stuff, and he was watching. And afterwards, he came in. There were about 3 of us, Bill Chambers and I don't know, and Bourne. Anyway, he took us to the band room. We thought, well, this is interesting. He said, now go to those band uniforms. And there was these 3-inch leather belts on the band uniform. He just took one of those out, and he said, bend over. And we did. And then he said, go tell your parents. And we didn't. He said, you know what you were doing with Mrs. So-and-so in there, and you're just a smart aleck good bunch, and just go tell, oh boy. A little more of that would be a cure of a lot of things. But anyway, be barbaric, but enough. Barbaric. Now there's a fascinating family. This is Marlon Kurtz, and he became Speaker of the House of Representatives in Cheyenne as a legislator. He was a premium legislator. He had a lot of guts, did his homework, got into debates, and then rose to top of the Speaker of the House. And then he became an administrator at the Japanese War Relocation Center because of his he was a teacher, because of his education background. His wife, his daughter Olita was in your class, and Dawn, who's one of our few remaining class of 49, is in my class. And they
Martha was in. Martha was pretty good.
Martha and Olita, yeah. Anyway, he was a force for good citizenship. He did, I think, the Lions Club. He was Cody Club. There were things that he did silently, especially when he learned who the Japanese Americans were out there, and that they weren't just somebody off the street. They were doctors and lawyers and farmers and fruit growers. He became very attuned to their needs and was often an advocate for them to get something from the War Department. He was a great guy, and so was his son Don and Olita and Martha.
He married a great gal, Lois
And the
Ingram.
mother too. She was a teacher.
She was a teacher.
Yes, there they are. Well, oh, there he is. I don't know where Waller is. There he's holding Katie there. There's Bill Waller with his, he was an influence for 3 generations of Cody kids. He came here in 47, 44, told great stories of his days. Well, tell what he was a tremendous athlete.
He was a coach's coach, and he was a terrific athlete as well. And we admired him, and he loved us, and you could tell it. That's really kind of strange. Even though he was tough, even though he was working on you, you had to run wind sprints and do a lot of stuff, but he was caring for you. He was helping you to be a man, be a citizen. Anyhow, Bill weighed, just as background, he weighed 175 pounds, and he played end for Bob Zupke's team at the University of Illinois. Bob Zupke coached Red Grange, And Bill played at the University of Illinois, went on to play at 175 pounds, and for George Hallis on the new Chicago Bears. So he had a background of athleticism that few people knew. I often wish there was something named for that guy around this town, because he nurtured kid after kid. They became coaches, they became teachers, they became responsible citizens. Both him and Glenn Livingston were responsible for bringing up a lot of Cody in those years. So bless him. Don't know where he is now, but I suspect fair place.
Well, I spoke at Southern Illinois University when I was in public life, and they flew him out. He became the coach at the Salukis at Southern Illinois University football, and I'm giving this talk, and here comes Waller out behind the curtain, and he fell over. He said, "Don't listen to that guy." He changed my life, I can tell you that. I was a big, fat, pimply-faced, knock-kneed kid, and he
Look
said,
at
"You're
him
going to
now."
run a mile." Well, I said, "Run a mile? I can walk a mile." But I did walk it in 6 minutes. There is a 4-minute mile, which escaped me.
Eluded.
And I could do a 6-minute mile. That's another story.
Great guy. Great families, daughters,
Oh,
and
boy.
grandchildren are still here.
Well, wait a minute, I'll tell you who that ain't. That's Jim Michener. This is Peg Cole and James Michener. Pete Krendler was a great friend of Peg's. Peg was into everything. This place would not be here without her. She pushed, she led, and she didn't like any women on the board. She said, "I'm it." And as long as I'm it, there won't be anybody other its out here. So she was instrumental in bringing James Michener, who stayed in our home, who became a lovely friend. And when I was in the East, he was dying of, he pulled the plug on himself. He said, I just can't go on, and so he took away the life support system. But I called him, I was at Harvard. He said, "Hello, professor." I said, "Are you kidding?" I said, "I don't even know what I'm doing back here." But he said, "You'll do all right. You'll be fine." But anyway, he came out to talk here, and as did the guy who did The Longest Day, who was the author of that. He spoke. It was when the buffalo flew in from the top of the hill unannounced on a cable. It was an unfortunate experience. Not enough of that. Anyway, there he is. But that's. But Peg. She would handle a meeting, and Pete Krendler and Jack Bugas, a couple of powerhouses, they'd get into a scrap, and Peg would just hit the gavel and say, "Why don't you two just go down to the Irma and have a drink and come back and be civil?" Well, they said, "We could do that," which they did. And then Peg would run the show, and she and Mr. Goffert ran the show. It wouldn't be here without her, or Goff, or Max McCracken. Anyway, there they are. And Jim never missed a beat when he came to Cody. He called, he was on the phone one day, and the librarian called. And I don't know who that was. And they said, is Mr. Michener at your home? I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, would he come to the library and talk?" Well, I said, "Here he is." So he said, "Mr. Michener, we could just have a quick KODI and an announcement that you'd be at the library. Would you do that?" He said, "For a librarian, I'll do anything." He went down. The place was packed. And somebody asked him a question. "You're the great civil libertarian in South Pacific. why don't you write something about the Japanese War Relocation Center? And his wife, Mari, was an intern at one of the camps, Mari Michener, down there somewhere, and he said, I don't want to pick that old scab, and I'm not going to ever speak on that. And that was his comment. He was real, and you'd never recognize him in an airport or anything else. He looks like every man, and he was every man in every way. Anyway, well, there's my brother down at the bottom.
That's right. I was younger.
And there's our dad, right up at the top. And you might look at his shirt. It says GM, and that was for the G-Bowl Miners over in Thermopolis. That's what he loved to play ball.
This is a part of culture in the West and in Wyoming as well as in Idaho and Montana. Little town baseball teams. There were no farm teams at the big leagues, but some of the people who came up or down from the major leagues played in some of these town teams. Well, Dad loved the game. He had gone up to Red Lodge after college to play for them. He became a union member. They paid him as a minor, and he never got down in the coal at all, ever. He just played ball. And he recruited these players here. Al and I, and many of you, if you look close at it, could probably name every one of them. Snooks McDonald, Blake House.
Gabby was our babysitter.
There's Gabby Barris in the front.
That's Mick's dad.
Mick's dad. Merle Rank is over on the side. That's Bob Rank's father, the great boxer, and was a barber in town. Doc Chambers, the postman, was a member, and then up on to our right and to the left, there's a guy by the name of Bill Dodd, who used to plow hoe the field, the flower beds that Mom had, and that members of the town. He liked flowers. He liked to help with the lilies, and he said, someday I'm going to be governor of Louisiana. And everybody'd laugh, and they'd have a drink or a smoke or what have you. Later, he became lieutenant governor of Louisiana. He never quite made governor, but he was a very interesting guy. So all these guys coming from various places to play ball, some of them stayed, some of them left. Dad used to talk about Speedy Swift from the Cincinnati Reds, played at Bridger, Montana. And so you had big leaguers and small leaguers.
Well, what they really had was part of the Negro leagues, and they only traveled by train because they had to sleep on the train. No one could put them up. But Dad said that this bunch went to Belfry or Edgar and played against the Negro League, who were totally segregated. And Dad said, I never saw people who could play baseball like that. And boy, they were terrific, and they were blackballed in every sense of the word. But it was Cody guys that would schedule them on several occasions, and they traveled, anonymously to stick together. But
it's interesting.
anyway, this was the bunch.
It's interesting to note that today is Jackie Robinson Day. Number 42 goes up on every ballpark in the country for a day. This is the day.
Well, there's old Gabby, the voice of the Bronx, and he was something else. And he loved athletics. His brother was Toonie Barris. We had Bobby's services here a couple, 3 months ago. That was Toonie's widow. when she had, what, they had 12 children, I think they did, or 10 or 12. Anyway, that's Gabby, the voice of the, he could almost announce a fake game. You could hear a baseball being hit with a pencil on the microphone or something like that. He was like Kurt Gowdy. Anyway, that was Gabby.
He played shortstop, as I remember, and he was always talking. He was always gabbing, always doing some kind of rude. So he got the Gabby name early on.
And that's Mick's dad and Jim's dad. And Marge's husband.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Well, there they are, and you've all seen that picture before, but you forget to know that the guy right here was Red Felsheim. He was the bartender. The other guys have all been identified by many people. There was the gunsmith, and there was Jimmy Patrick and Bill Damaris. It was his parents that owned the Needle Bath Plunge, which was the bronze boot, which burned to the ground. But Bill Damaris I was in the legislature, and he always wanted me to bring about slot machines. Bring up slot machines. I said, I don't want to bring up slot machines. There were about 15 churches in Cody, and none of them wanted slot machines. Anyway, they probably do now. And this was well, anyway, there they are. They're all identified because the pictures by picture, but this was the key, and we forget to see. And he had sons and daughters who were great athletes, and Cody Felsheim. And anyway, there they are, drinking and smoking and. God almighty, just makes you sick.
Great names like Two Dog Johnson, and there's some others up there that, and there's an Oriental up in the left-hand corner.
That's right, yes.
Su Fu. He was a cook, wasn't he, Matt?
I think so, yeah.
Let's go on.
Heaven's sick.
R.W. Allen up.
Yeah.
A group of bankers at a meeting here in Cody.
Tell Pete, what it is that makes a banker. What is it what is the outstanding attribute there?
Well, a good friend of mine who was a banker retired, and by the way, there's stories about these bankers, but he was trying to give advice on his retirement to any young man who wanted to be a banker. He said, let me give you 2 pieces of advice. You should have a blue suit to give you that look of dignity, and hemorrhoids to give you that look of concern.
I thought that was lovely. I think so many. Anyway.
Granddad, Papu Bill, Dad's dad, had a story of a banker in Jackson. He said, we went out to look at a herd of sheep, and Bill was representing the guy and wanted to get a loan. And the banker went with them, and when they got out to see the herd, the chap, the sheepherder, the owner of the ranch, was giving him a guided tour, and they wouldn't get out of the car. So he just said, well, I've got this herd here, and they're all shorn. And the banker said, well, at least on this side.
Anyway, that other one was R.W. Allen. That was Sam's. This is R.W. He was the banker here with Shoshone. And then Sam Allen, that next slide, was a very great citizen. And his home was just recently sold by their son, who worked for me when I was in public life. And so Sam and married a beautiful gal named Jerry, and she was one of the great stars of stage in Cody, with some great plays that were very popular here, but that was Sam Allen. And I told you about, he had a little difficulty with hearing, and that was Kenny Nelson and Chuck Badavinas were on a 3-dayer. They were very calm when they were doing that drinking because they did not have any venal thoughts. But anyway, they went to Sam. They knew he had a hearing problem. They said, Sam, that $200,000 we have there in that CD, we think we want to take that. And Sam said, what? We want to get that. But, and Sam said, well, have we not done our job? And then they did josh him along, but it was a difficult time for Sam. Anyway, but he took it well. I mean, that's what you're doing, Cody. Take your lumps.
Take your lumps
and move
and do
on.
it well.
Yes. If you're thin-skinned, you don't live here.
Oh, boy.
Now, there's Buck Buchanan up South Fork, that little road there from the end of the reservoir on up to, it was called Buchanan Boulevard. He was a county commissioner. He said, we're gonna make a nice road out of that. And I don't know, he and his wife, Sue Buchanan, they were great friends of Paul Schweitzer at the Schweitzer Gymnasium. There were the Orchards that lived here. You can't get all these people in, but the Orchards lived here, and they were in that house on Canyon Avenue, which was a southwestern house. And the Schweitzers lost a son. He was 6 years old, and he died of pneumonia, like several of the young people in those ages died of pneumonia. Anyway, Buck was a big county commissioner. He's in the Heritage Museum as part of the guy at the garage, a big picture of him. Anyway, different, and his daughter is still in Cheyenne. She's about 95. And he was the head coach of the, 100 years ago, 1923. Is there anyone that knows anything about the class of 1923? We don't know any of those people, except this guy's name is Nielsen. And this must be a Neff or something, but anyway. But Buck was the powerhouse. And that was a home movie. They would play the piano, and then they come on, and some woman from Meeteetse saw the robber take the jewels, and the piano would play. She said, "You put that back." He got alarmed, and then Buck said, "Well, that's just a movie." And she said, "Well, who is that said that?" Just, "Oh, it's that Fatty Buchanan boy." What was he? Yeah, Fatty Buchanan. Anyway, enough of that. You can go first. There, oh my God, there, oh. Tell them about Martin. People may have known, but his kin are still around.
Yeah, remarkable guy. Came from the East. He prosecuted Pretty Boy Crowley, and he got death threats from that gang forever after. In fact, it made him decide, I don't want to practice in the East. And he came west, and his family made a big impact here. His daughter married
Jack Peterson.
Jack Peterson. Mm-hmm. And Martin had the ranch now that is Siggins up the South Fork. But he was a bright, sharp guy. He joined in the community, was a powerhouse lawyer, got into some real tangles with some local lawyers, and those stories go on and on. But he made an impact. He became a part of this community and was...
He taught Louis Kasulis how to play golf.
Yes, and he was
Louis became a pro-am, but Martin had prosecuted some other people in the mob in Nassau County, And then not just the death threat for Pretty Boy, but other people just said, we're gonna bomb your house, we'll get you. And so he came west, and he ran for district judge and was defeated by Don Harkins, who was from Worland. But he was a great force, and he narrated the trial of Christ over KGHL Billings with the voices of Pontius Pilate and the other voices. And somewhere that recording was done, it went all over the country. He was an actor, a lawyer, a wizard, but he died of smoking cigarettes. He said, these sons of bitches are killing me, and they did. Anyway, great guy, but a great force around here. Kyle Todd, that was Harry Jackson's buddy. And they were inseparable, and well, you could go on a bit about Kyle. He was
Pitchfork Ranch, foreman of the Pitchfork Ranch, and married to one of Charlie Belden's daughters. And there's a most dramatic pair of statues, busts, that were done by Harry Jackson of his friend Cal. Because Cal, one time, became not only suicidal, but literally shot himself in the face, shot his lower jaw nearly off, and survived it, and lived later. Well, Harry made two statues, one of Cal before, handsome guy with the cowboy hat, and one with his jaw shattered. And they are remarkable pieces of art. But, and his wife, Margot, had good friends all over town, one of them being my mother-in-law. Lynn's mother and Margot were great friends. But that's part of the magical ranch, Pitchfork Ranch history.
Well, now there's Sam Van Arsdale with the hat on was full of beans. He could come up to a kid and make some noises and pinch you and all that stuff. He had three beautiful children. One went to the Naval Academy, Bob, and Sam, an older boy, and then Joanne, a daughter who was a contemporary of my wife, and then Wayne Messenger, the young member, the bank president right there. But Van had a real thing. It was almost a monopoly. He sold Kohler light plants with gas operated. And the city of Cody, in those days, it took a while for them to sober up. The city of Cody ran on the money they got from the electrical system. While the electrical system went to hell in a handbasket, there'd be a lightning and flash, and big sections of Cody would go off, and they'd say, well, why doesn't somebody fix the electrical system? Said, because they use the money then they don't have to tax people, they just use so Sam, he figured there's a way out of that. He just sold these Kohler light plants. They were very cheap, but he sold a lot of them. The Kohler light plant guy, but he was well known, and his family was well known. They all, as I said, went into the military. And Wayne, of course, went on to the bank, and Wayne Messenger, and he was a great part of the community. His son is over in Thermopolis. Anyway, that's little odds and ends. Oh my God. Slim was never on a horse there, but he rode that rail. And Dewey took a picture of him. But he looked like he might have been a banker who was thinking of hemorrhoids sitting there, the way he was perched. But he was good for the tourists. And there were those railings all over town, but the only one left is across from the Irma.
Yeah, those little, the wells that went downstairs,
Oh,
right
yeah.
off the sidewalk, into the businesses in town. So you would have to walk down the stairs, through a door, into the basement to load goods. And Slim and a friend of his, whose name escapes me, would sit on those
Roy
rails.
Bazona,
Roy Bazona, my God. And
they would
were-
sit there
Yeah,
waiting for the tourists to take their picture.
that's what old Phonograph Jones never sat on the rails, but he would stand out in front of the Irma to talk. I've already told, but don't stop me. The Phonograph, they asked him, they said, were you alive during Prohibition? And Phonograph said, well, yeah, I'm 85 at the time I saw him talking to tourists in front of the Irma. He said, well, what did you think of Prohibition? And Phonograph said, well, it was better than no whiskey at all.
I love that. All right, there you go. But Slim was, and he was a great subject of Jim Bama.
Yeah, yeah.
James loved to portray him. He came into my office one day, he said, you know, Jim Bama, he posed me and he sold that painting for, I think it was $10,000, and I want you to get me a share of that money. I said, well, did he pay you to sit? He said, yeah. Well, I said, did he pay you $50? I said, well, that's fair. And you know, it's his painting. Well, I tell you, he never could figure that. I said, you need to go to Goppert. I'm not going to get into that. Check with Ernie. Okay. Oh, Brownie Newton took a lot of things to the grave. But there he is. That was A.C. Newton's son. He was a great friend of our uncle, Glenn, who sadly suffered some sad things. He was in the pen for years at Rawlins, but the boys found his picture. It had a number, and it said, is this your Uncle Glenn? I said, it is. He was a check writer. He was one of the finest check writers who ever had written a check. And he would go up to people and say, and with Brownie, say, you know Millard Simpson over in Cody? I have heard him. Bill Simpson. That's my friend. And he said, well, I'll just not take your cattle. I'll just take your truck too. And what do you want for it? He said $3,000. Well, in those days, if you wrote a check, believe this, you could write a check for something that'd be 60 days in jail. For 1,000, it'd be a felony. I mean, and they got rid of all that stuff, but not then. And so he wrote this check, and it bounced like an Air Jordan basketball. And he went to the pen for a goodly few months, but Brownie covered for him, and Brownie came in to see me one day, now that they're all gone, especially Brownie. He said, I think I got some stock here that but my dad owned, and it was penny stock or something. And Brownie said, I know how to sign his signature. Why don't you notarize it? I said, Brownie, you need to talk to my uncle. But Brownie took a lot of those things with him, but he was an entrepreneur and a really pioneer. And I'm sure Dewey must have captured him, but he was a piece of work. Yep, yes, go ahead now. Oh, there it is.
Oh, man.
You want to talk about John Vogel?
No, I'm just a great entrepreneur himself, and that family's been here for a long time. The Vogel building with the two eyes on the owls was his building. He was a shrewd man, and I don't know whether he was directly immigrated from Germany, but I think he was. I think
He
came
had
here.
a German accent,
Yeah.
and the word Vogel means owl or bird in German. I lived over there for 2 years in the Army, and I learned that. The only thing I learned was beer.
Yeah.
That had a universal symbol. Anyway, he got very concerned, though. He was also an undertaker. He was the last guy to let you down in this area. And he came to my dad, and he said, Sims, he says, German accent, there's something going on. He said, they're going up to the creamy people up in Billings, and they ship them back in a urine. And Dad said, well, I never did that. Now, Joe. But anyway, he complained about that. He wanted to sue somebody up in Billings. But I tell you, John Vogel was, and his son was a big piece of work and lived in Jackson too. Anyway, he was an amazing, happy guy. He was that gut there is a Budweiser tumor. He loved German beer. Well, there's Otto Frank. A lot of controversy about Otto. Otto's, that's Frank's Peak over there by
And
Matisse, and
Little town of Otto, and a group of Hutterites live there now, in that town, doing tree work of all things. But that guy was a big-time cattle raiser, and
he died of a rifle that went off as he was crawling through a fence, if I recall. But there are a lot of people who said there was lots of other reasons that somebody would have been there to pull the trigger. But he was tough. He was a big businessman, and he accumulated a lot of wealth. And he was a cattle guy from the first order.
they had he had an employee who was a cowhand by the name of, this is a very unlikely name, but his name was Pussy Isham. And Pussy Isham had a cleft palate, and they showed him, Otto Frank was going to be modern, and he was going to plant some corn to feed cattle with. And Dad always told the story of being out there during the time that they were going to show that piece of property. And Pussy was following him along, and Otto Frank said, Pussy, we're going to plant corn here to feed the cattle. And Pussy got very upset and threw his hat down and said, "Torn? Who ever heard of torn in a cowman's country?"
And somebody shot Pussy
Yes,
too.
that's true.
And he was in the hospital, and he'd had a serious wound in his throat. And they said, Pussy, what can we do for you? And he said, just whiskey. And he said, well, you haven't got any mouth. He said, pour it in here. And I remember that story.
Yeah, I do too.
Pussy Isham and torn in the Talman. Oh, there we go. Dewey Dominic, and Lee. They were from the east. The doctors came from the east. Dr. Ridgway and Emily and Lee and Dewey and Jones, Gouch. They came for the West and to raise their families, and they had wonderful families. There are many of them around, but Dewey was he was bigger than life, and she was just a saint. She was a saint, a lady, and beautiful children. And Dewey had a rough streak there in him at time. Ornery would be what he went and bought a baboon from W.R. Richards, one of your kin, when he sold the taxidermy shop. Maybe you've never seen a baboon, but there are certain parts of it that are just barbaric, and Dewey would come on the Rotary show with this red-butted baboon, unbelievable sharp features, and then he'd play the harmonica for the baboon, and he'd give great talks to the guests out there at the 7D, and there's thank God their heritage is clear here, right there. There's but I'll never forget. Dad and Mom had Ridgways and Dominics and Gouch and Jones for a cocktail in the summer to welcome them to Cody. Well, I'll tell you, the old man was pretty deft at putting a martini together that had very few olives and very few onions. And I tell you, Pete and I were out in the yard as these people staggered out of our home. Well, who are they? Well, they're all doctors. Or somebody needs to tend them. We were very young. But anyway, they were, and he was a great doctor. And
Dewey was Dad's doctor. Dad really liked Dewey. Chet Ridgway, his partner, was Mom's doctor. They all made house calls. They'd come to your house with that black bag, and if you had some problems, they would fix you right there. And if you go down to what I think is now, there's an employment office or something, it's right across the street from Town Hall. It's an old building right on brick building.
still there.
It was the clinic, Mary, the clinic where those four doctors were. I went in there just about 2 years ago, and I said, by any chance, do you still have the lights that went on in that one booth which had the X-ray? It had a green light for go, a caution light, don't go in, and a red light to stop. Darned if they don't still have that board with those three lights on it. They did it at least a year or so ago. But that was the clinic we all attended, and those were the guys that saved us. What have we been in town now? Marshall is still here. Hap is up in the valley. Is Marshall? Oh, there's Mary. and your brother was Yale. Your dad was Yale, as I remember. And Mary has been a professor. And this is a pleasure to see you. How nice. That's just great. Well, it's been a great family and a great tradition. And thank God they're still here. That's a part that I love.
I'm going to interject something right here. Dewey Dominic was the doctor who delivered me. Besides me, who all in this audience was delivered by Dewey Dominic? There's three of us, four of us. Very good.
I was named for him. His
Yes, you
actual
were.
name was DeWitt.
Yes, it
Went
was.
by Dewey, but my folks got into an argument about what to name their newborn. And the nurse said, well, nobody's named one after him, and he's delivered 2,000 babies. That's where my name came from.
That's great.
Now we know who's blamed.
I didn't say that.
Well, there he is. He was a character.
Yes, he was. I didn't know it.
I know Dad used to talk about him, Johnny Reckless Davis. He apparently he had, somebody can stop me, he had a bit of a, maybe what you call today is essential tremor. And he could handle a gun like this, but there was a certain aberration to the aiming of it, and they called him Old Reckless. And that was Ruby Davis's, back, and then that was Jack's mother. But anyway, you'll just have to say that this guy was well known. He was in law enforcement. He was truly a character, and he knew the country. I think he did some trapping, he did some other things, but we just thought we'd throw him in and see if, since you're doing the Last Supper here, if anybody knows some more thing about Johnny Reckless. He called him Johnny Reckless Davis. Anyway, enough.
I've got to go back one. You don't have to go back on the pictures. But when I think of Buck Buchanan, I think the name Johnny Reckless Davis. Johnny is not in this story, but there was a guy by the name of Cowboy Coleman who was a B-grade movie actor, actually was in movies. This was sort of applied to your comment about the boys and feeling no pain taking that box of whiskey. Dad, Buck Buchanan, and Cowboy Coleman were going to go through the park and down to the south end because Dad's dad and family lived down there, and they were going to take a trip. And the park just had troopers who ran the place instead of rangers. And there was just a log across the east entrance, just a big log propped up on a couple of other logs. So it was also during Prohibition. And Dad and Buck and Cowboy were having a good time driving that car. Nobody there to stop them. When they got up to the gate, it was about 5 in the afternoon, and a guy by the name of Bob Lilly was the gatekeeper. And so the log was across the road. And Buck got out and said, well, we want to get to the south end. Oh, he says, you can't do that. It's 5 o'clock. It's time to close up. Oh, he said, we're so sorry about that. And you probably want to get home. Well, I've got a wife. I do. I want to get there. Well, would you like to have a drink before you do that? And he said, well, do you have some with you? And he said, yes, we do. So they fed Bob Lilly a drink, and then they fed Bob Lilly another drink, and then they fed Bob Lilly a third drink. And old Bob, at the end of it, he walked over to the log, and he picked it up, and he pulled it back, and he said, now, boys, you go on down there to the south end. When you get there, I want you to tell those boys at the south end, this is one lily you left in full bloom.
Well, there's old Spike. They named the field after him. That's young Bob Moore. That's one of the Moore boys right there. Scott, he's around. Jimmy Walworth, who was very much hard. I don't know who that might have been. It's hard to see. But anyway, Spike was a force for good with the kids. He was a disciplinarian. I remember Bill played for Spike, but he didn't do well with basketball. Colin did pretty well, and then of course Bob Moore and I and Louis Casoulis and Cathcart all played, and Don Kurtz all played. But this is Scott. But he was an educator. He was a good citizen, and was they named the field after him. Had a great family, many of them around, and in the Bighorn Basin. But there's Spike. He was a taskmaster. He was a perfectionist.
It's great to watch all those kids. We happened to be watching a freshman basketball game this a few years back. Don Kurtz, Al, me, Jerry Lanchberry, and we were watching young Lanchberry play. It was great. Al's grandson was playing.
Oh, yeah.
Colin took a picture of the 4 of us octogenarians sitting there in the bleachers, and then he captioned the picture, "Deep Bench."
Now there's some real. Those were wonderful people. They're still with us, but they were pioneers of, after Elmer Faust, which I have just a quick one of him. John and Ray Elgin. He flew into. They were flying air firefighting, and Ray got into one of those valleys and lost the altitude, and that was a very critical death. And then John but they were just, the Air Service and Cody didn't just come because Hank Coe was a great worker for all that, and we have good service, and we'll do more because we have a great air strip. But they were always doing something for somebody, loading. I don't know what the cookie flight was to Cheyenne, but
I can tell that.
yes, you could tell.
I was in Vietnam at the time, and the city of Cody and Powell gathered up cookies, baked them, put them on the Elgin's plane. They flew it to Cheyenne, where the National Guard loaded it on a 130, and they flew to Da Nang and delivered cookies to the Marines at Da Nang from Cody, Wyoming, and Powell. And that's the story.
Wasn't that woman called Gobs of Cookies Gould?
Yes, and her husband was Colonel Gould from Powell, that was the commander of the port at Da Nang. And he was a full bird colonel. Good memory.
Right. Well, we try to keep it honed beautifully, and keeps it. Yes. Yeah. There's a guy. He was with Husky. Had a voice of the angels. I don't know if you ever saw the original "Kiss Me, Kate," but who was the great actor of who did in Kiss Me, Kiss and Kismet too? But
Howard Keel in
Howard Keel. But he and Jerry Allen did Kiss Me, Kate, and I'll tell you, they played that. I think they even went to Billings to show. He had this. The two of them with the duet was magical, and his daughter is still here. I saw her not too long ago.
She's right out here.
Yes, there she is, dear. Great. Yeah, that's you. And the mother lived on, and he was a great Rotarian. He was very active in the Rotary with his voice, and he was just a sweet and wonderful guy, and a great addition to the force of Husky Oil. But
and
he wanted,
talented. Boy, was he talented.
yeah, he was really talented, something else. Well, there's the old pro. We had a show, someone was here a couple of years ago honoring Elmer Faust. Well, he was the first guy to, he made that plane, if I think.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what he made that, whatever he did. And he had two daughters here, and I just saw them not long ago.
They're here in town.
They were here in town, two great gals, and Minnie Billings was his mother-in-law, who was Glenn Billings' kin, of Billings family up in the South Fork. There are lots of stories about the Billings family. There are some of them are true.
I think we better keep moving on.
No. Elmer was the first pioneer. Then came the Elgins. Then came
Bill
Mundy,
Mundy.
and then Stoust, and then the Elgins. So when you talk about Air Service and Cody, it all started with those guys. They were the pioneers. They're their heritage.
Among those who did aerobatics up over this town, can't forget Rex Vanderhoff, Dewey's dad, who was a flyer.
He was.
And, anyhow, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, there they are. Sam and Carrie Decker, they ran the lumber yard down there, and their kin is right here in the front row, one of them, Karen. And the house that has just been removed there on the corner of Canyon or something, was their house, and that my mother designed that house. It was architecture. She built that house, and Pete and I collected the rocks that are in the fire, that are in the chimney. They're going to keep those and put our names on every rock. But anyway, Sam was they, big time citizen, lumber, and Kay had a classical music thing. I don't know how often was it played, and she'd spin some records out there, and none of us, I'd never listened to. Well, Mom had that kind of stuff, but she would teach people the beauty of classical music in KODI, and that was big time. That was a part of the heritage of Cody for many years.
Not to mention the children and the talent of this one here, who has a
Yes.
beautiful voice to this day.
It's the voice of angels right
boy.
there.
Let me tell you, the house, by the way, was built for Kay's mother and father, Clayton and
Clayton
Gertrude Burke. And they were the original owners and founders of Diamond Lumber, which Sam ran for that time. Sam and Hank Cole were great friends.
You're lucky you watch. Okay, keep going.
Let's go on to the next one. Speaking of children, here we go.
That's our dog Brucey. I'm feeding him. He could sit up, you could tell that. And no, but that picture was taken, people said that was at the Church of Transfiguration. That wasn't. It was taken at the Murray Center. The Murray Center was called the Woodbury House. And when my grandfather died in December of 40, Dad went over to close his law practice in 41. And so we went to Jackson in April and spent the whole summer right up until Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And then the war started a month later, but we don't know where the bell is, but we're going to get that one to the Bury Center. That's not what it was, but anyway.
Well, we had bunk beds in that old Woodbury cabin. We were there for almost a whole year. Went to a little one-room schoolhouse out on the flats, gone now. And it was an experience and a half. Lightning used to hit that bell, and Al had the lower bunk, and I had the upper bunk. Sometimes he'd jump up there when the lightning struck. I'd have to kick him out.
And the folks would occasionally, on a summer night, go into Jackson to play with the games of chance. And somebody said, they were gambling in Jackson. And he said, the state senator said, well, it's not a game of chance. You don't have a chance in Jackson. And Pete and I would wait up for them to come home, but they did come home. But they were young, and we were spirited. But there we were. That was 1941. That's right. Yeah.
Moving along to the next.
Oh.
This is one that I wanted to share, and this is Al fitting his uniform many years after he got out of the military. And tell us, what is the blue, what do you call it?
Epaulets.
Agilette?
Yeah, they said I'd lost my epaulets, and I said I never knew I had them. No, but I decided I'd put it on and see if it fit, and it did. I weighed about 180, I weigh about 170 now. But anyway, so they wanted a picture of that with, but that was the Army of Occupation of Germany. So in one sense, I was in World War II, but the war had ended 10 years before. So I was the last month of the Army of Occupation of Germany. We fired a lot of ammunition and armored personnel carriers and followed the tanks and all that, waiting for the Ruskies to go through the Fulda Gap. But those were marksman things. I was
He was always good.
a good marksman with the M1 and the carbine. I figured with the pistol I could have thrown it at someone. I couldn't. I never could figure that out. But those were different days. And there's Peter.
Who's that good-looking guy?
I don't
Wow,
know. I don't.
with his navy wings.
he was the cat of the Navy. I was married, and Pete ranged the earth in a hedonistic fashion until he met Lynn. It was just, look at him, the cat. God almighty, he's just sick, the whole thing.
Pete, tell us a little bit about your carrier landings and flying and.
Logged in about 1,400 hours flying off of the USS Lake Champlain and the USS Forrestal. So it's just fun to watch some of these new Maverick things that have a lot of carrier stuff on them, because I've got a memory of that. But you had 6 months sea duty, 6 months shore duty. That was not conducive to family life. And even though there was a chance to stay in, I didn't like the idea of not having a family and a wife, and that's why I married that girl right back there. So those were the days. Nice of you to show the picture, and it's long gone. Oh, that's a good picture.
Tell us a little bit about, this is New York, isn't it?
I was coming home because Ann was pregnant with Bill, and we flew back from Frankfurt, and the doctor said, Ann, you must fly, you can't drive. Anyway, so she flew back to Cody, and Pete happened to be right there in New York, and we sat on a grassy knoll there. That was the 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels on that emblem, and it was the 12th Armored Infantry Battalion, and Pete and I sat there and talked about what we had done in the service. Both of us had suffered some indignities. We shared the time of our, well, we were honorably discharged. But anyway, we wore the uniform for a couple days because we didn't have any clothes, and we went to every ball. We went to Ebbets Field, and they let us in free. We watched, oh God, where did we go? We went all over the place. We got to these.
Yankees Field. We
One
saw
of these.
Joe DiMaggio of all things.
Well.
Holy cow.
And then we'd been gone for 2 years, so we went to get a hamburger some night. We went to Longchamp. It was open all night. And I said, there's a steak tartare. Look at that. My God, and the other, there were two. Anyway, but never knew that it was just raw meat, with the lemon on it and a boiled or a poached egg, and we learned some
things.
tricks. But anyway, we had a great reunion because we'd had our times as brothers where we'd punch each other out, and that ended
Until we got big enough to hurt
until we
each
got
other.
big enough to hurt each other. Yeah.
We quit that.
And thank you both for your service. These are some of the people that contributed to our collection today. And have we got one more picture, Mac? I want a special thank you to Brian, to Robin, and Sandy and Jim Pedersen donated all the scrapbooks at the VFW to the Cody or the Park County Archives, and I snapped this photograph a couple of years ago. But the archives in Cody, the only one in Wyoming that's a county archives that does such a wonderful job in collecting and identifying, and the help that we've gotten from the archives for all our talks really matches what we get from the museum here. And this is a way of saying thank you.
You are amazing. Robin is amazing.
And this is our other helper. And he always interjects no matter what we say. But Mac, runs the photography end down in the the McCracken Library, but he does the digitization. When I worked here for a year digitizing Dad's photography, Mac was the one that got it identified and worked it all the way through, and has been here ever since. And he's a big help for every talk that we give here. Mac, thank you. And then we have somebody hiding over here in the dark. Come on out here. Eric is the one that makes it all work for us. Thank you. And then we have others, but we've thanked them before and we'll do it again. But thank you. We do have about 1 minute for questions. We'd planned 30 minutes, but these guys added another 20 people, and not my fault. Any questions? Anybody?
Any questions for the boys?
I think they did a pretty darn good job of covering everything. Thank you. And the best part of it for me was renewing my friendship with these two elder statesmen. I used to call them young boys, but they're still older than I am. But it's been great sharing the stories and the time we've done in the last 3 talks. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We have one last time here. I've been asked to point out the fact that, we lost Steve Singer here a week and a half ago or so. Today is his birthday.
Oh, well, happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Steve.
Steve Singer.
Oh, yes.
It's his birthday.
I loved one of the eulogies about Steve that said, for Steve, everything was a good idea.
Very true. Thank you very much for being with us today.